The room was already talking when Seraphine Morrow walked in. She felt it before she heard it, that particular shift in the air when a crowd stops pretending not to watch. 40 noble families packed into the palace's grand reception hall, each dressed in their finest colors, each carrying their most practiced smiles, and every single one of them turned, just slightly, when she stepped through the carved doors wearing mourning black. She did not slow down. 3 months ago, General Cale Monroe had been given the most celebrated state funeral the kingdom had seen in a generation. His coffin had been carried through the capital on the shoulders of 6 decorated soldiers. Thousands had lined the streets. The Alpha King himself had stood on the palace steps with his head bowed as the procession passed. People had wept in public. Songs had already been written about the general who had never lost a campaign. Then the mourning ended, as it always does for everyone except the person left behind, and Seraphine Morrow had returned to a house where the fire needed tending and the roof needed repair and the accounts needed balancing, and none of it was going to do itself. She was 32 years old. She had been married to Cale for 9 years. She had never once asked the court for anything, and she had no intention of starting now. The letter requesting her attendance at the succession rites had come on official royal paper, sealed with black wax and the king's crest. It was not truly a request. She knew that. Everyone in the kingdom understood that a summons from the crown wearing the word request on its face was still a summons. So she had packed a single bag, left careful instructions with old Peter, who had served Cale since before she had ever known the general, and traveled for days to the capital through autumn roads that were already turning cold. The hall was enormous. She had been here before, years ago, when Cale had been honored after the Northern campaign. Back then she had stood 2 steps behind him in a deep green dress and watched him accept the applause of people who would never have followed him into actual danger. She had thought then that a room full of people cheering a soldier was a very different thing from a room full of people willing to become one. Tonight the hall was full of the same kind of people. She moved toward the far side of the room, looking for a seat that would allow her to be present without being central. That was the thing about grief that no one warned you about, it made you visible in ways you had never asked for. Everyone wanted to look at you. Everyone wanted to say something kind. No one quite knew what to say, so they said things that were technically caring but landed like small stones dropped from a height. Lady Morrow. A soft voice at her left. She turned. Lady Cresswell, a woman in her 50s with a sympathetic tilt to her head that Seraphine recognized immediately as the expression people wore when they wanted credit for caring without the effort of actually doing so. We are also relieved you could attend. Cale would have wanted you to carry on. Seraphine smiled pleasantly. He would have wanted me to carry on correctly, she said. He was very specific about things like that. Lady Cresswell blinked. Seraphine moved on before the woman could form a reply. She found a seat near the back pillar, close enough to an exit that she could leave without it becoming a statement. She placed her bag under the chair, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the raised platform at the front of the hall where the king's throne waited, empty for now, carrying that particular weight that only empty thrones possess. She had never spoken to Selim Draven directly. She had seen him twice from a distance, once at Cale's funeral, and once 3 years before at a military ceremony where he had stood on a raised platform and looked out over several hundred uniformed soldiers with an expression she had not been able to read. He was known to be cold, highly capable, and deeply uninterested in the social rituals that the court treated as religion. He had ruled alone for 11 years since his father's passing, and in that time the kingdom had remained stable, its borders protected, its treasury managed with care. Its king had not entertained the idea of a consort. Everyone had opinions about that. Seraphine had never had the energy to hold opinions about men she had never spoken to. The hall settled slowly as the evening grew late. People drifted to their seats with the practiced reluctance of those who wanted to be seen arriving rather than simply seated. Seraphine observed them through the kind of peripheral attention she had spent 9 years developing at Cale's official functions: still face, active mind, nothing telegraphed. Then the doors at the far end of the platform opened and the room changed. There were no trumpets. No formal announcement. Selim Draven simply walked in, and the sound in the hall dropped the way sound drops when something genuinely commanding enters a space. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, and he moved without any of the deliberate performance that powerful men typically use to fill a room. He did not need to fill it. The room reorganized itself around him naturally, the way water reorganizes itself around something solid. He took the throne and looked out over the assembly with dark, still eyes. And for one strange moment, Seraphine had the uncomfortable sensation that he was not surveying the room generally but looking for something in particular. She told herself that was the kind of thought that arrived when a person had been alone too long. The proceedings were mostly formal. Documents were read aloud. Pledges were renewed. Various nobles rose at the appropriate moment and said the appropriate things with the appropriate gravity. Seraphine stood when she was expected to, said what was required of her, and sat back down without elaboration. But twice during the formal session, she looked up and found the king's gaze already on her. Not the casual sweep of a man surveying a crowd. Not the polite acknowledgement of a host checking on a guest. Something more deliberate than that. Something with considerably more intention behind it. Both times, she looked directly back without dropping her eyes. She was a generous widow. She had spent 9 years learning that the most dangerous thing you could do in any room was let someone see you flinch first. The proceedings ended late. The hall broke into movement and conversation as people rose from their chairs. Seraphine was reaching for her bag when a young palace attendant appeared at her side, not a general servant, she noted, but someone from the king's personal staff, wearing the grey uniform with silver trim at the collar. Lady Morrow, the attendant said quietly. His Majesty requests a private word. She looked at the young man's face. He was slightly nervous but not urgently so. This was not a crisis situation. This had been planned. She set her bag back down. Where? She asked. The East Corridor study. I will escort you. She followed him through a door that most of the hall would not have noticed, down a quieter passage lit by oil lanterns, and into a room that was modest by palace standards, bookshelves, a long table, 2 chairs positioned on either side of a modest fireplace. No attending court, no audience in ceremonial dress, no witnesses. Selim Draven was already there, standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when she came in, and the attendant left quietly behind her, pulling the door closed. The king looked at her across the width of the room for a moment. Lady Morrow, he said. His voice was low and even and entirely without decoration. Your Majesty, she replied. He gestured to one of the chairs. She sat, because there was no strategic reason to refuse. He took the chair across from her, no desk between them, no attendants, no formal distance. Just the fire and 2 people and the particular quiet of a conversation that had not yet begun. I will not waste your time with preamble, he said. I appreciate that, she replied, and meant it completely. He held her gaze with the same steadiness she had noticed from across the throne room. I have decided to take a consort, he said. I have decided that consort will be you. The fire made a small sound. Seraphine said nothing for 4 full seconds, not because she was shocked into silence but because she always thought before she spoke, and this was the kind of thing that required proper thought. Why? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something closer to the look a person gets when a test they quietly set has been passed in exactly the expected way. Because, he said, for 9 years I watched your husband lead men into impossible situations and returned from every one of them. Every campaign he executed that should have failed and did not, every strategy that held when it had no right to, had your thinking behind it. He was exceptional at what he did. And he was intelligent enough to know when someone else was better at the parts he was not. That made him more exceptional than most men I have known. She looked at him carefully. Cale was remarkable, she said. He was, the king agreed. And you made him more so. I want someone at this court who thinks that way. Not someone who performs thinking. Someone who actually does it. She was quiet for another moment. Outside the study window, through the stone walls, she could hear the hall still emptying, guests talking, laughter rising and falling, entirely unaware of what was happening in this small room. I am a widow, she said evenly. 3 months past the end of official mourning. I have no political alliances worth trading, no family army behind me, no great house to bring to this arrangement. Half the court already considers me irrelevant. If you are choosing a consort for strategic value, there are 20 better options in the hall you just left. I do not want a strategic alliance, he said. I have sufficient of those. They cost more than they deliver and create obligations that outlast their usefulness. What I want is someone who thinks clearly under pressure, acts without theater, and is not afraid of me. She held his gaze without blinking. I am not afraid of you. I know, he said. That is part of why we are having this conversation and not a different one. She studied him for a long, open moment. He did not grow uncomfortable under it. He simply waited, which told her considerably more about him than anything he had said. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would, he replied. And there it was, Seraphine Morrow, widow, a woman without a single remaining advantage in the world she had once known, pulled her chair 1 inch closer to the fire and began to negotiate with the most powerful man in the kingdom as though it were the most natural thing she had ever done. She spoke without softening a word of it. She asked for the restoration of land grants promised to Kale's veterans, men who had served and bled and come home to find the paperwork stored in a court that had already moved on. She asked for the protection of the Morrow estate villages through the winter, which the court had been preparing to absorb into a larger administrative district that would have made them invisible. She asked for her right to live, with her own escort and her own means, if she chose to do so, no argument, no legal obstruction, no political consequence. She laid each condition out in clear, plain language, one at a time, watching his face as she did. He did not argue with any of them. He agreed to all 3 before she had finished the last sentence. She studied him again after he said it. Looking for the place where a person like this would hide a condition of his own, a small thing, a catch buried in the agreement, the way powerful people often hid the true cost of their generosity. She could not find one. That was the most surprising thing that had happened to her in 3 months. She looked at the fire for a moment, and then she looked back at him. Very well, she said. I will consider it formally agreed. He nodded once, and the conversation shifted, and they talked for another half-hour about practical matters, timeline, announcement, the specific language of the veteran land grants, and by the time she walked back through the corridor to the hall, the last of the guests were leaving and the servants were beginning to extinguish the upper lights, and Seraphine Morrow was carrying, in addition to her single travel bag, the quiet, disorienting knowledge that her life had just changed shape. Again. Not in grief this time. In something she did not yet have a name for. The announcement came 4 days later, at the morning court session, delivered in the even, unhurried voice of the king's official herald. Selim Draven, Alpha King, had chosen Seraphine Morrow as his royal consort. She stood 2 steps to the right of the throne and watched the hall hear it. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the room began to talk the way rooms always talked when they could not quite believe what they had just heard, and Seraphine looked straight ahead and thought, briefly, privately, about how Kale would have found this genuinely funny. That real laugh of his, the one that only ever came out in private, deep and unguarded. He would have laughed until he had to sit down. She held on to that thought like a handhold. She was going to need every form of steadiness she had. The first week inside the palace was like learning to walk on a floor that moved without warning. Seraphine had been given rooms in the East Wing, not the official consort quarters, which she had quietly requested to avoid, because she was not ready to occupy a space designed for a role she had not fully decided to inhabit. The rooms she was given instead were comfortable and well lit, with windows that faced the inner garden rather than the crowded outer courtyard, and she arranged her few belongings in the space with the efficient calm of someone long accustomed to making a place livable quickly, without decoration, without sentiment. Then she began to pay attention. That was, she had found over the years, the most useful thing a person could do in any new environment. Not talk. Not assert. Not make herself known. Simply watch. She attended the morning briefings she was invited to and said almost nothing during them. She watched how the court organized itself around the king, who positioned themselves closest to him without being asked, who watched him from a careful distance, who spoke with the easy confidence of people who felt secure and who chose every word with the particular precision of people hiding something underneath it. She noticed the supply chains for the palace kitchens and identified 2 inefficiencies within her first week that she mentioned to no one. She noted which doors the senior advisors used and at what hours. She observed which of the king's household staff moved with genuine authority and which moved with performed authority, which was a more important distinction than most people recognized. And she noticed Lady Voss. She would have noticed her regardless, because Lady Voss was the kind of woman who ensured she was noticed. Perhaps 35, tall and careful in the way she moved, with a particular kind of polished appearance that is maintained as deliberately as a weapon is maintained, and used in much the same spirit. She had been a fixture at court for 3 years, had attended every significant gathering where the king was present, and wore the deep blue that was Selim's known preference with a frequency that could not have been accidental. The court's whispers, which Seraphine had listened to carefully since her arrival, told a consistent story. Lady Voss had believed herself to be the most likely consort candidate. She had positioned herself accordingly. And now, without warning or precedent or any logic she could have predicted, the position had gone to a widow with no political alliances, no army, no house behind her, and money still fresh enough to be visible. When Seraphine walked into the morning briefing on her 3rd day in the palace, Lady Voss was already seated near the head of the oval table, wearing a dress that was architecturally impressive and the exact shade of the king's preferred color. She looked at Seraphine with a smile that was technically perfect and contained no warmth at all. "Lady Morrow," she said. "How wonderfully brave of you, taking on this role so soon after your bereavement. All of us admire your resilience enormously." The word brave in that tone, Seraphine understood, meant something close to reckless. The word resilience meant something close to desperation. "Grief does not improve with waiting," Seraphine said pleasantly. "I have always found that movement serves better than stillness." She took her seat and opened the briefing document in front of her and did not look at Lady Voss again, which she understood was the more effective response to the interaction than anything she could have said next. When you give someone nothing to respond to, they are left holding their own sharpness with nowhere to direct it. The morning briefing was long and covered the administrative concerns of 3 border territories, a trade negotiation with a coastal province, and a drainage infrastructure question in the southern villages that everyone agreed was urgent and no one had yet resolved. Seraphine listened to all of it with the same level of attention she gave to everything. When the meeting concluded and people were rising from their chairs, the king spoke her name. "Lady Morrow." A moment. The room emptied quickly, with the efficiency of people who understood that a moment from the king was not an invitation for lingering. Within 90 seconds, Seraphine and Selim were alone in the briefing room, the long table between them, morning light coming through the high windows. "You know the southern drainage issue," he said. It was not quite a question. "I do," she said. "Kale managed supply logistics through that region for 2 years. The problem is not the drainage design, it is that the pipe contracts were awarded through a process that prioritized cost over material quality, and the materials used do not hold under the spring flooding pressure. You need replacement, not repair, and you need it before next spring." He looked at her for a moment. "Who do you recommend for the replacement contract?" "Not the same firm," she said. "There are 2 suppliers in the western provinces with better records. I can give you their names and the specific records you should request before signing anything." He nodded slowly. Not with surprise, more with the expression of someone confirming something they had already suspected. "Write it up," he said. "Bring it to the evening session." She brought it. He read it without comment, asked 2 questions, and the following morning issued a directive to the relevant administrative office. She heard about it through the channels she was building, quietly and without announcement, among the palace staff she had identified as both competent and honest, which was a shorter list than it should have been. The evening sessions became something she had not planned on. They began practically, documents, decisions, the specific follow-through on the conditions she had set before agreeing to the arrangement. The veteran land grants were moving through the proper channels with a speed they had not moved before. The Moro estate villages had received their winter supply allocations. Seraphine reviewed the paperwork and asked questions and occasionally rewrote sentences that were vague in ways that would cause problems later, and the king read her revisions and rarely disagreed. But the sessions ran longer than the paperwork required. He asked her things that were not strictly relevant to the documents in front of them. Her views on the Eastern trade routes. Her assessment of the loyalty structure among the senior advisors, which she gave him carefully and honestly, including the parts he probably did not want to hear. Her opinion on a council appointment that was coming up for consideration, which she refused to give initially on the grounds that she did not know enough about the candidate yet, and then gave a week later once she had learned enough. He always listened. She had known powerful men who performed listening, who arranged their faces into attentiveness while their minds were already somewhere else. Selim did not perform. She could tell because he asked follow-up questions at the next session that referenced specific things she had said, not the general shape of what she had said but the precise words. He had been paying attention. That was rarer than it should have been in a person with his level of authority. She found herself staying later in those evenings than she had intended to. She would look up at some point and find that 2 hours had passed while it had felt like 40 minutes, and she would make her quiet exit and walk back through the garden corridor to the east wing and find herself thinking about what they had been discussing in a way that was not purely analytical. She noted that. She did not yet do anything with the noting. The court was not subtle about its observations. Everyone was watching her, how she carried herself, who she spoke to, how she managed the particular social minefield of being new and significant and without allies in a place that ran on alliances. Lady Voss had not attempted another direct engagement since the briefing room exchange, which Seraphine understood meant she had switched to working through others. A rumor appeared in the second week, whispered between the right people in the right rooms, that Seraphine had exerted inappropriate influence over the southern drainage contract, specifically that she had directed it toward suppliers connected to Kale's old business contacts for personal gain. This was incorrect on every factual point. Seraphine became aware of the rumor on a Tuesday and spent Wednesday identifying the two most likely sources and the route through which the information was traveling. She did nothing about it directly. She simply made sure that the full procurement documentation for the drainage decision was filed through the public administrative record 2 days earlier than required, which meant anyone who wished to verify the selection process could do so with ease and would find it completely transparent. The rumor died in 4 days. Lady Voss moved on to a different approach. The next one involved a member of the social committee who managed the palace's former guest sitting arrangements. Seraphine found herself placed, at a formal dinner for visiting dignitaries, at a table position that communicated something very specific about her standing, lower than her role should have placed her, adjacent to guests who were known for their long memories and their enjoyment of finding weakness. She attended the dinner, sat exactly where she had been placed, and spent the evening in conversation with the elderly trade delegate on her left, who turned out to have spent 40 years working the eastern shipping lanes and knew more genuinely interesting things about how the world functioned than anyone else in the room. She talked with him for 3 hours and learned 6 things she had not known before. She did not make a complaint about the sitting. She did mention, 2 days later in a morning briefing, something the trade delegate had told her about a disruption in the eastern shipping route that none of the official reports had reflected yet. Selim had looked at her across the table with an expression she was learning to identify, attention that was slightly sharper than usual, and asked how she had obtained that information. "I had dinner with the delegate," she said. "He was placed next to me." A brief, careful silence. He knew. She was fairly certain he knew exactly what the seating arrangement had been and who was likely behind it. "His report to the council is scheduled for Thursday," Selim said. "I would like you present for it." "Of course," she said. After the briefing, Lady Voss had looked at her from across the corridor with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Seraphine nodded to her pleasantly and continued on her way. She was not interested in a court war. Court wars were inefficient and they cost everyone involved far more than they gained. What she was interested in was continuing to be precisely what she had presented herself as, useful, reliable, and not particularly impressed by the weapons most people around her were accustomed to wielding. The king, she was beginning to understand, was the same way. He had ruled alone for 11 years not because he was isolated but because he had not found, in 11 years, anyone worth trusting with the parts of the work that required actual honesty rather than performance. She understood that. She had watched Cale spend 9 years building a small circle of people he genuinely trusted, and even that circle had been tested repeatedly by the court's habit of making loyalty inconvenient. One evening in the third week, after the official work had been set aside and they had been talking for an hour about nothing that would appear in any official record, she asked him something she had been turning over for days. "When did you decide?" she asked. He looked at her. "On which occasion?" "To choose me," she said. "Specifically?" "Not the reasoning you gave me in the study, the moment you actually decided." He was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned lower, the room slightly darker, and he looked into it with the particular expression of a man considering how honest to be. "The Northern Campaign Review," he said. 4 years ago. I reviewed the full strategic record of that campaign because I was assessing whether to deploy similar tactics in the eastern border situation. The tactical brilliance in that record was obvious. But there were also a dozen places where the plan had been modified mid-execution in ways that preserved the goal while protecting the men involved, and those modifications had a different quality to them than the original design. Smaller scale. More focused on the specific people on the ground rather than the strategic outcome in the abstract. He paused. Cale's tactical reports never mentioned consultation, he said. But those modifications were not his thinking. They were someone who knew what the men could actually carry. Someone who knew that strategy lives in the particular, not just the general. Seraphine looked at the fire. "He always asked me," she said quietly. "Every time. He said strategy designed without someone asking about the people inside it is just theory with a plan attached." "He was right," Selim said. She was quiet for a moment. "He also knew," she said, "that I would not always agree with him. And he asked anyway." "That," Selim said, with something that might, on someone with fewer walls around it, have been called warmth, "is precisely what I meant by him being smarter than most." She looked at him then, across the low firelight, and for the first time since she had arrived in this palace, she felt something that was not strategy and was not calculation and was not grief. It was the careful, tentative beginning of something she had not expected to feel again. She did not name it yet. She was not ready to name it yet. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, with full attention and no decision made, sitting with it carefully until she understood what it was and what to do with it. She said goodnight and went back to the east wing. And she stayed awake for a long time, listening to the palace settle around her in the dark, thinking about the Northern Campaign modifications and a man who had asked his wife every single time, and another man sitting alone by a fire who had apparently been paying closer attention than anyone had known for 4 years, and what it meant that neither of these things felt as surprising to her as they should have. She was not, she decided as she finally fell asleep, going to pretend she had not noticed. That was not, and had never been, how she operated. She found the first thread by accident, in the lower records room on a quiet afternoon in her 5th week at the palace. She had been given access to the administrative archives as part of her expanded advisory role, a concession that Selim had quietly arranged without making it a formal announcement, which she appreciated because announcements invited arguments and she was not interested in argument about whether she was allowed to be useful. She had gone to the records room to follow up on a land grant verification for one of Cale's veterans whose paperwork had stalled in a procedural gap, and while walking through the relevant filing drawers she had opened the wrong cabinet by one position and found herself looking at a supply requisition that made her stop. It was an order for materials to be delivered to the Northern Gatehouse. She knew the Northern Gatehouse. Cale had maintained detailed maps of every military and administrative structure in the kingdom, and she had spent years cross-referencing those maps during planning sessions. The Northern Gatehouse had been decommissioned 4 years ago. The official decommission record was in the same archive system she was currently working within. The building should not have been receiving supply deliveries of any kind. She read the requisition twice. The materials listed included heavy rope in commercial quantities, 3 types of precision timing hardware, and a measured amount of a stabilizing compound used in controlled demolition work. She closed the drawer carefully. She stayed in the records room for another 45 minutes, working on the veteran land grant paperwork exactly as she had intended, and when she left she walked back to the east wing at her usual pace and gave no indication to anyone she passed that anything had changed. That evening she sent a message through a route she had established in her second week, not palace communication channels, which she understood were monitored, but through a merchant contact she had identified who moved letters between the palace district and the city proper without formality or records. The message went to a man named Gideon, a retired intelligence officer who had served the Crown's intelligence function for 30 years before a quiet removal following a change in senior advisory personnel. He was now, officially, in the business of property valuation in the capital's western district. He owed Kale Morrow a debt he had never been able to repay. By extension, and with a single piece of correspondence early in her first week, he had made it clear he understood that debt now rested with her. She did not tell Salem. She thought about that decision carefully, over 2 evenings, before committing to it. She was aware that choosing to investigate something concerning the king's security without informing him could be interpreted as a significant breach of the trust they were carefully building. She was also aware that if she brought him 3 words and a suspicious requisition form, he would face a choice between investigating discreetly and addressing it through official channels, and official channels in a court with embedded people had a documented history of alerting the very individuals under examination. She knew how to move quietly. She was not certain the palace's official mechanisms did. She gave Gideon 6 days. In those 6 days she attended court functions, she sat in briefings, she revised documents and asked careful questions, and she spent one particularly long evening with Salem discussing a proposed border arrangement with a neighboring territory that she had significant concerns about and was not shy about saying so. He had pushed back on 2 of her points and conceded on the third, and the third was the one that would have created a 20-year obligation the kingdom could not honor without compromising the eastern supply routes. She did not think about the records room during any of this. Or rather, she thought about it constantly, in the part of her mind that ran parallel to whatever conversation was in front of her, but she did not let it reach her face or her hands or the pace of her breathing, because if she was wrong she did not want to have alarmed anyone, and if she was right she could not afford to have warned anyone. Gideon's response came on the 7th day. She read it alone in the East Wing rooms at midnight, after the palace had quieted, and by the time she had finished she understood that she had been right, and that right was considerably worse than she had expected. 3 of the king's senior advisors, men who had served at Salem's council table for years, men who had attended briefings alongside her and spoken words of welcome and performed the rituals of loyal service, had been building something in the decommissioned Northern Gate House. Not a military asset for the kingdom. A mechanism designed to collapse the primary stone bridge on the king's monthly inspection ride through the northern estates. The kind of collapse that would appear to any investigating eye as structural failure from neglect. The kind that a man on horseback at the center of the bridge would not survive. The timing mechanism was set for 5 weeks and 3 days from the date on the requisition form. That gave her approximately 4 weeks. She sat with that information for 2 hours without moving. She thought about Salem. She thought about 11 years of ruling alone, carefully and well, without anyone beside him who genuinely watched his back. She thought about the particular loneliness of that, which she understood in a way she had not expected to, and she thought about the fact that he had sat across from her in this very building and told her he wanted someone who was not afraid. She was not afraid. She was also not willing to let anything happen to him. She wrote back to Gideon with specific instructions and a timeline. She did not use the word investigation in any of her correspondence. She did not need to. Gideon had spent 30 years in the business of quietly removing problems without creating the noise that attracted new ones, and he understood what she needed without requiring it to be said explicitly. Over the following 11 days, all 3 advisors were removed from their positions through entirely legitimate means. Each man had something in his record that justified administrative reassignment, a conflict of interest filing that had been overlooked, a performance review that had been delayed, a procedural requirement that created grounds for temporary suspension pending review. These were real issues. Gideon simply ensured they were acted upon rather than continued to be set aside. The mechanism in the Northern Gate House was disassembled on a Sunday night when the structure was empty, by Gideon's people who had no formal connection to the palace, using tools they had brought and materials they took away with them. By Monday morning the gatehouse was exactly what the official record said it was, a decommissioned building with no active function. The king's inspection ride was scheduled for 2 weeks after that. He rode the bridge without incident, because there was no longer any reason he would not. Seraphim watched him leave that morning from a window in the east wing, and she watched the gate close behind the riding party, and she stayed at that window for a long time. It was over. Clean and complete and invisible in all the ways that mattered. She was not entirely prepared for what happened 3 weeks later. Gideon, old, meticulous, and possessed of the particular wisdom that comes from 3 decades of understanding that a single person holding a complete secret is more fragile than 2 honest people sharing the weight of it, had included a single careful line in an unrelated intelligence document submitted to the king's administrative office. Not a name, not a description, not a direct reference. A single line about a structural matter at the Northern Gatehouse being resolved through private initiative. It was enough. Selim came to her rooms himself. No message first. No summons delivered through a staff member. A knock at the door of the East Wing quarters at 7 in the evening, and when she opened it and saw his face she understood immediately, from the specific quality of the stillness there, that he knew. He came inside. She closed the door. They stood in the sitting room with the garden light fading through the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You found it," he said. "Yes," she said. "You handled it without telling me." It was not quite a question. His voice carried something she had not heard from him before, not anger, but the particular tightness of a person working very hard against something they are feeling. "I did," she said. Why? She had prepared for this, because she prepared for everything. Because bringing you 3 names and a suspicious supply form required evidence. Collecting evidence through official channels would have taken weeks, would have required disclosure to people whose loyalty was not verified, and very likely would have alerted the individuals involved before the process was complete. Moving outside those channels meant it could be resolved cleanly, completely, and without the public fracture they were relying on to create instability in the council. "You put yourself at risk," he said. "I was careful," she said. "That is not," he stopped. Started again. "That is not the point, Seraphine." Her name. Again, her given name, which he did not use in formal settings, which she had noticed each time he had used it and never acknowledged. She did not acknowledge it now either. But she noted that his voice on those 3 syllables had something in it she had not heard there before, and it cost her something to keep her expression even. "I am not accustomed," he said, carefully, each word placed with visible deliberateness, "to being afraid for another person." The room was very quiet. She looked at him. She saw the truth of what he had said in his face, the particular difficulty of a man who had ruled alone for 11 years admitting to something as unpracticed and inconvenient as that. "Neither am I," she said. "Not anymore. I thought I was past it." He held her gaze, and something passed between them in that moment, not a declaration, not an action, but the kind of shared understanding that does not need either of those things. The kind that happens when 2 people who have both spent a long time alone recognize, simultaneously, that they are not quite as alone as they had organized their lives to accommodate. He stayed for another hour. They talked about very little that could be written down and everything that mattered, and when he left the room she pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the door and stood there for a long moment thinking about what it meant that for the first time in months she had not, at any point during that conversation, felt the hollow weight that had lived in her chest since the day Kay was buried. She did not name what was growing between them. Not yet. Naming things too early was how you broke them. She went to see the palace healer the following week, as part of a routine health assessment that her former role required. She sat in the examination room while Doran, a calm, skilled woman of about 50 who had the excellent professional habit of stating findings plainly and then allowing the receiving person time to process them, worked through the standard assessments. Then Doran paused. She reviewed something in her instrument and reviewed it again, and then she looked at Seraphim with an expression that was careful and kind and contained significant information. "I need to revise what I was about to tell you," Doran said quietly. Seraphim looked at her. "You are expecting," Doran said. "But not 1 child." Silence. 2, Doran said. "Twins. Both appear healthy and well-positioned. I am very confident in the reading." Seraphim sat very still on the edge of the examination table. She looked at a point on the wall above Doran's head and she did not speak for a considerable length of time. Doran, who was excellent at her work, did not feel the silence. She simply waited. "Are you certain?" Seraphine asked finally. "Quite certain," Doran said. "I would like to schedule a follow-up in 2 weeks, but the initial assessment is clear." Seraphine nodded once. She thanked Doran with genuine warmth. She walked back to the east wing at her usual pace and sat down in the chair beside the window and looked out at the garden, where the evening light was doing something remarkable with the old stone fountain, and she set her hands flat on her knees and thought. Twins. 2 children. She needed to tell him. She was already building toward how, forming the words, deciding on the timing, thinking about what the conversation would require from both of them. She was 3 days into that process when the document arrived. It came inside a routine packet of legal correspondence that her expanded role gave her access to, treaty and contract archives that touched on the administrative conditions she had negotiated. She almost missed it, because it was filed under a category heading that seemed unrelated to anything current, and the language was the careful, neutral prose of historical law rather than active administration. It was a betrothal contract. Signed in blood law, which was not merely a formal name but a specific legal category with binding force that ordinary contracts did not carry, and dated 22 years prior, when Selim had been a prince of 20 and his father had been managing the kingdom's alliances through the oldest available currency, which was family commitment. The contract bound the heir of the Draven line to the daughter of the Aldermere House, a ruling family of the Eastern Territories. Blood law betrothals could not be set aside by one party's decision or preference. They required a formal council tribunal, the active agreement of both contracted families, and a legal dissolution ruling, a process that, in any contested case, could take years and guaranteed a period of severe strain with the Eastern Territories, who had maintained a dormant border dispute with the kingdom for 2 decades. The wrong handling of this would reopen that dispute with full force. She read the contract twice. Then a third time, very slowly, looking for anything she had missed. A dissolution clause. A conditional term that had already been met. Any legal mechanism that might have already resolved this. There was nothing. She sat at her writing table with the document in front of her, and through the window she could see the lights in the wing across the garden where Selim's private study was located, and she thought about what she knew and what she felt and what was right, and she stayed with all 3 of those things until they had resolved into something clear. She could not stay. She wanted to. That was the truth of it, and she had not spent her life being dishonest with herself and she was not going to start now. She wanted to stay with a force that surprised her, because she had believed for the past several months that she had permanently rearranged herself into someone who did not want things of this kind anymore. She had been wrong about that, which she supposed was its own kind of information. But wanting to stay and being right to stay were 2 separate questions, and she had always made decisions based on what was right rather than what she wanted, and she was not going to stop now simply because what was right felt, in this instance, like the worst option available. The twins were real. She felt that fully and immediately, more real than anything she had felt in months, which itself told her something important. They would be born into the center of a blood law dispute if she stayed. They would be used, not from malice, necessarily, but from the simple, inescapable logic of power, which always found ways to use the things and people adjacent to it. They would become arguments in a legal and political case before they were old enough to know what a legal case was. She had watched the court use people her husband had loved. She had watched it happen slowly and completely and with great practiced efficiency, and Kale had not been able to stop it and she had not been able to stop it and neither of them had known how to fight something that moved like water through every wall you built against it. She was not going to let her children be Water's next project. She packed what she had brought, which was not much, because she had never unpacked as though she intended to stay permanently. She sat at the writing table and wrote a letter. She wrote it 3 times before the words were what she needed them to be. The letter was not bitter. She did not want to be bitter. Bitterness was a way of staying somewhere in spirit after you had left in body, and she intended to leave completely. The letter was honest, which was harder than bitterness and more important. She told him what she had found and where it was filed so he could verify it himself. She told him about the twins, their existence, the assessment from Doran, the health report she had been given. She told him that she believed he was genuinely a good king, which she understood was not a small thing and did not say it as though it were. She told him that the blood law situation was his to resolve in whatever manner was right, and that she was removing herself from the picture so that her presence did not complicate a legal process that needed to be handled on its own merits, without additional political weight pressing on it from an unexpected angle. She told him she would raise the children knowing their father's name and their father's history, and that she would not hide them or use them, and that when they were old enough the choice of what relationship to have with him would belong entirely to them. She told him she was sorry, not for leaving, because she believed she was making the correct decision, but for the timing of it, and for the fact that the correct decision felt, in this moment, more painful than most incorrect ones she had made in her life. She sealed the letter and placed it in the exact center of the writing table, where it could not be missed. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the east wing in the hour before dawn, through the side door that opened onto the garden path, and through the garden, and through the servants' gate on the garden's far wall, and into the city that was just beginning to wake. She did not look back. Not because she was not tempted to. Because she understood that looking back was the beginning of hesitating, and hesitating was the beginning of changing your mind, and she could not afford to change her mind now. She had made the right decision. She held on to that as she walked, and she kept walking, and the palace gate disappeared behind the first turn, and the city opened ahead of her, and the dawn came up cold and clear, and Seraphine Morrow, widow, former consort, and mother of 2 children not yet born, set her face toward the north road and did not stop. The northern road was not a pleasant road at that time of year. It ran for the first 2 days through the capital's outskirts and the dense farming communities that supplied the city, where the traffic was heavy enough that a single woman with a travel bag attracted no attention at all. Then it thinned, and the landscape opened into the wide, rolling hill country of the mid-territories, where the villages were smaller and the distances between them longer and the roads had not been maintained with the same care as the routes that served the capital's commerce. She used her maiden name, Fletcher, and told anyone who asked that she was traveling to visit family in the north. She said it the way a person says something true and unremarkable, because it was true, in the sense that the north was where she intended to build whatever came next, and whatever came next would belong to her in the way that things belong to you when you have built them yourself rather than being given them. No one looked twice. Frightened people attracted questions. Seraphine did not look frightened. She looked like a woman who knew where she was going, and that impression was accurate enough to serve. She spent the first night in a traveler's house at the edge of a market town, in a clean room with a window that latched properly, and slept for 5 hours in the particular way she had learned to sleep during Kale's longer campaigns, quickly, completely, and with the practical understanding that rest was a tool like any other and required maintenance. On the second day she hired a seat on a trade cart moving toward the northern passes, driven by an older man named Ellis who spoke when he had something worth saying and was quiet the rest of the time, which she found an excellent quality in a traveling companion. They covered more distance in 2 days than she would have managed on foot in 4. She paid him fairly and thanked him at the fork where their routes diverged. She was in the hill country by the end of the 3rd day. Ashford was not on most maps. It was the kind of settlement that had existed long enough to have its own gravity, its own rhythms, its own internal logic, its own understanding of which questions were welcome and which were not, without ever having grown large enough to attract official documentation. 300 people, perhaps slightly more in the summer when the seasonal workers came through. A Thursday market. A small meeting hall that doubled as a shelter in hard weather. A guest house run by a woman named Olive, whose practical nature revealed itself immediately in the way she assessed new arrivals, not with suspicion but with the calm, experienced eye of someone deciding whether a person was going to be honest about their intentions and their ability to pay. She had been directed to Ashford by a letter she had kept for 2 years, written by one of Kale's longest-serving veterans, a man named Conrad who had fought under him for a decade and whose regard for Seraphine had always been expressed through very practical gestures, good information at the right moment, a contact offered when she might need it, a note that said, in plain words, that if she ever needed a place the court could not easily locate, there was one, and here was how to reach it. She had smiled at that note and thought she would never use it. Conrad opened his door on the 5th evening of her journey and looked at her face and stepped back without a question, and held the door open, and that was all the welcome she needed. His wife, Bridget, put food on the table without comment and filled a cup and left it beside the plate and found reasons to be in another room while Seraphine ate. That was a different kind of welcome, equally valuable. She rented the 2 available rooms from Olive the following morning, paid 3 months ahead, and began the work of becoming someone who had always been there. She was good at this. She had done versions of it before, arriving in unfamiliar places at Cale's side and making herself useful and known and trusted quickly, because that was what the general situations required. The difference here was that she was doing it alone, for herself, with no role defined in advance and no timeline set by anyone else's needs. She found she did not mind that at all. She helped Conrad with the accounts for his small trading operation, which had become slightly complicated by a contract he had entered the previous year without fully reading. She fixed the water line at the guest house that had been losing pressure for months, using a solution she had learned about in the Morrow Estate's maintenance records. She identified which of Ashford's residents were worth greeting with conversation and which preferred a nod, and she modulated herself accordingly, and within 3 weeks she moved through the village with the ease of someone who belonged there. She sent a weekly letter to Peter through a route she had established in the capital, careful, coded, brief. Peter's replies came back in the same form, and through those quiet exchanges she learned what the palace was doing without needing names or explicit statements to understand it. Selim had not issued a public announcement about her departure. There was no official statement, no public search, no court proclamation explaining the change. Whatever he was managing it quietly. She had expected that. She knew how he worked. What she had not expected was the particular feeling that arrived when Peter's notes confirmed, week after week, that the silence continued, that he had not used the court's machinery against her, had not sent an official party to retrieve what the Crown might legally have argued was its concern, had not made her disappearance into a story about his own governance. It meant more to her than she was entirely comfortable acknowledging. The twins arrived in late spring. The labor was long, 16 hours from the first sign to the last, and managed by a midwife named Clara, who had 30 years in her field and the particular composure of someone who has attended so many births that she has arrived at a settled, deep-rooted understanding that the process is designed to work and usually does. Clara had seen most things that could happen and had opinions about all of them, and she communicated those opinions with calm efficiency and no unnecessary drama, which was exactly what Seraphine needed. Olive sat outside the door for the entire duration and came in twice with clean water and otherwise stayed out of the way, because she understood, without being told, which was what made her good at reading people, that Seraphine was not the kind of person who needed attendance. She needed competence and she needed space, and Olive provided both. The boy came first. She named him Owen. The girl came 22 minutes later, with the slightly impatient energy of someone who had been waiting for their turn and found the delay unreasonable. She named her Nell. She lay in the quiet of the room with one of them resting in each arm in the first hour after, Owen already asleep with the complete confidence of a person who has decided the world is acceptable, Nell still awake and looking at her with the dark, focused attention of someone trying to understand a complicated thing. Seraphine looked at the ceiling of the guesthouse room in Ashford and felt something settle in her that she had not felt in longer than she could precisely locate. She had thought she might feel the loss more sharply in this moment, the absence of a person to share it with. She had expected it to arrive with the particular weight that major moments carry when you are the only one present for them. Instead she felt, with great clarity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That was not nothing. In fact, she thought, looking at the two small faces that were already, impossibly, completely themselves, that was almost everything. She wrote to Selim 3 weeks after the birth. She did not write to the palace directly. She used the private correspondence route that Gideon had established years ago for sensitive material, a channel that moved through 3 separate intermediaries before reaching its destination, leaving no trail that connected sender and recipient in any official record. She told him the twins had arrived. She told him they were healthy. She told him their names. She wrote it in the same plain, honest language she used for everything that mattered, and she did not fill the rest of the page with anything else, because there was nothing else she was ready to say yet. She did not know with certainty that the letter reached him. She kept moving forward. Owen grew fast and noticed everything. He had dark hair and the evaluating, watchful quality of a person who was always taking a room's measure before deciding how to engage with it. He was serious in the way that babies are sometimes serious, fully committed to whatever he was doing, uninterested in performance. Nell grew with the same dark hair and a settled patience that reminded Seraphine, in unguarded moments that she did not particularly try to guard, of the quality she had noticed in Selim across a firelit room on more than one evening. Not stillness for its own sake. The stillness of a person who had decided that waiting for the right moment was more effective than filling every moment with noise. She did the accounts for 2 of Ashford's small businesses now, and the work was good and straightforward and used her skills without requiring her to perform anything she was not. Bridget had become something close to a friend, the kind that is built slowly and practically, through shared tasks and honest conversation and the particular trust that develops when 2 capable women realize neither of them needs anything from the other except honesty and occasional company. Olive had offered her the rooms at a long-term rate that was genuinely fair, and Seraphine had accepted and paid 3 months ahead again, and Olive had nodded once and that had been the end of the negotiation. 8 months after she had left the palace, Peter's weekly note contained a single additional line. The blood-law betrothal with the Aldermere family had been formally dissolved. The process had gone to tribunal, as it was required to. Both families had agreed to the dissolution. The Aldermere daughter, it appeared, had her own reasons for preferring the contract ended, which Seraphine had not known and found she was glad to know now. The Eastern territorial relationship would require careful managing for the foreseeable future, but the legal tie was gone. She sat with that for an entire day. She thought about what it meant and what it did not necessarily mean and what she was not yet ready to conclude, and she went to sleep that night having not reached any conclusions, which was honest, because she was not in a position to reach conclusions from 4 days ride away with 8 months of distance between them and 2 infants who required her full attention and whom she had built her entire present life around. She woke up at her usual hour and fed them and dressed them and went to help Bridget with the Thursday market setup, because the Thursday market was in 4 days and the setup required planning. She was good at planning. She was less good, it turned out, at not thinking about a particular man sitting alone in a study 4 days ride south. She did not tell anyone that. But on a clear autumn morning, 11 months after she had left the palace before dawn with 1 bag and a letter on a writing table, she was sitting in the chair by the guest house window feeding Nell her morning meal, Owen making his small contented sounds in the court behind her, and she heard hooves on the road below. She heard them most mornings. The North Road ran past Ashford's main street and carried steady traffic at that hour. She did not look down. Then Olive knocked at her door. 1 single soft knock. Not the usual 2. That particular sound reached some part of Seraphine that was always alert, even when the rest of her was occupied. She settled Nell carefully and went to the door. Olive was standing in the corridor with an expression she had not worn before in all the months Seraphine had known her, the expression of a person holding something delicate and uncertain of its nature. "There is a man downstairs," Olive said. "He arrived on 1 horse, alone. He did not give his name. He said to tell you he has brought no guards, no official escort, no announcement of any kind. He said to tell you he will only come up if you wish to see him, and if you do not, he will leave without argument or delay." Seraphine was very still. "What does he look like?" she asked. Olive considered it with the honest care she applied to most things. "Tall," she said. "Quiet in the way that people who are accustomed to a great deal of noise become quiet when they want to. He looks like someone who has ridden a long way and decided not to mention it. A long way. 4 days, at reasonable pace. Less, if he had pushed." Seraphine looked back into the room, at Nell, who had returned to her meal with the focused energy of someone who found interruptions unreasonable. At Owen in his cot, who had opened his eyes and was looking at the ceiling with the interested expression he brought to most things. At the window, and the road below, and the morning light. "Tell him," she said, "that I will come down in a few minutes." Olive nodded once and went. Seraphine went to the window and looked down. He was standing a few feet from his horse, not at the guest house door, not pressing forward. just standing in the road in plain dark clothing with nothing that marked him as anything except a man who had come a long way and was prepared to wait for whatever answer he was given. He looked up. She did not move back from the window. She let him see her. For a moment, just a moment, they looked at each other across the distance and neither of them moved and neither of them looked away, and Seraphine felt something in her chest that she had spent 11 months carefully not naming finally arrive at the word she had been keeping it from. She stepped back from the window. She picked up Nell and settled Owen more securely in his blanket and took one breath, long and even, the way she had learned to breathe before anything that required full steadiness. Then she carried her daughter down the stairs to meet the father who had ridden 4 days through autumn roads, alone, without announcement, without command, without any of the considerable machinery available to him, and waited. He was standing near the small fireplace in Olive's front room when she came down the stairs. Not close to it, not warming himself, just standing near it, the way a person stands near something solid when they are waiting and do not want to appear to be waiting. He held his traveling gloves in one hand and he was not fidgeting, which she recognized as an act of considerable will. He turned when he heard her on the staircase. He saw Nell first. She watched it happen on his face in the space of a single second, the particular kind of impact that cannot be performed or prepared for, the moment when something you have imagined becomes real and you understand, fully and completely, that imagining was nothing. Not a small inadequate version of the thing. Nothing. The thing itself was entirely new, entirely beyond whatever construction you had built of it in the dark. His expression did not break. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, total shift of a man who has just had the coordinates of his life rearrange themselves around a new point, and who is very carefully not allowing himself to respond to that too quickly because he is aware he is in a room where responses have weight. He looked at Nell. Then he looked at Seraphine. She has dark hair, he said, very quietly. They both do, Seraphine said. Owen is upstairs. He was just waking up. A brief, almost invisible pause. He was absorbing the name. She could see him do it. I dissolved the blood law betrothal, he said. It required a formal tribunal, the agreement of both families, and a 40-month legal process that cost more politically than I will burden you with today. But it is finished. Fully and permanently resolved. I know, she said. Peter wrote. Something moved in his expression. Then you have known for some time. For 3 weeks, she said. And you did not, he stopped. He looked at her with something that was not quite an accusation, because he understood he did not have the standing to accuse her of anything, but that was not entirely something else either. I needed to think, she said. I do not make decisions quickly when they matter. I know that about you, he said. And then, after a moment, something that might have been a smaller version of the expression she was used to seeing on his face when she had done something that confirmed what he had already believed, that is one of the things I know about you. She looked at him carefully. He looked back. Neither of them reached for the easier option, which would have been to talk around the thing they had both come here to talk about. You came alone, she said. Yes. No staff. No guards. No formal notification to the village administration. No. You rode 4 days. 4.5, he said. I pushed the second day. She absorbed that. Why not send a letter first, she asked. I gave you a correspondence route. Because I did not want to give you the option of composing a reply, he said. He said it directly, without apology, because he was not the kind of person who apologized for honesty. A letter allows a considered response. I did not want your considered response. I wanted to be in a room with you, where you could see that I am not here as a king arriving to retrieve something. I am here as a man who has done the thing that needed doing and traveled the distance that needed traveling and is now asking. The word asking had a specific weight in it. She heard the weight. Asking what, she said. It was not quite a question. She needed to hear him say it precisely. To try again, he said. Not to resume what existed before, I understand that cannot simply continue as though 11 months have not occurred, as though you did not make a decision that cost you something real, as though we are not standing in a different room in a different town than either of us expected to be standing in. Something new. Built on what we actually know now, which is considerably more than what we knew before, and built with full choice on your part at every step. He held her gaze and did not add anything to that. She looked at him. She looked at the room. At the modest fireplace and the plain furnishings and the window that faced the Thursday market setup happening outside on the street, where she could see Bridget directing a young man with a cart in the specific, efficient tone she used when something needed doing correctly and quickly. She looked at Nell in her arms, who had fallen asleep during the walk downstairs with the absolute confidence of someone for whom the world was a reliably good place. And she thought about what honest meant, in this specific moment, to her specifically. "You hurt me," she said. Not in an accusatory way. In the factual way she said things that were true. Not deliberately, and not through any action you took. But the situation hurt me, and I do not want to pretend it did not, because pretending would make this conversation easier to have. I left something I had not wanted to leave, and I have spent 11 months building a good life here, which I am not prepared to give up simply because you have resolved a legal problem. He did not flinch at any of that. He held her gaze through all of it. "I am not asking you to give anything up," he said. "I am not asking you to return to the palace on my schedule, or on anyone's schedule, or at all, if that is not what you want. I am asking whether there is a path. What that path looks like would be entirely a matter of conversation between us." "That would be a very complicated conversation," she said. "I am aware of that. The children are not a negotiating point," she said. "They are not a reason to reach a particular agreement or a reason to reach any agreement at all. They are two people who need stability and consistency and who are not old enough to have opinions about royal succession or blood law or any of the rest of it." "I understand that completely," he said. "I would not have it any other way." She studied him. "Owen is upstairs," she said again. "I think you should meet them before we discuss anything else." He nodded, and she led him up the stairs, and when she opened the door to the room, Owen was sitting up in his cot examining the edge of his blanket with the thoroughgoing focus of a small person who has identified an object of genuine scientific interest. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at Selim with the straightforward, undefended curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to manage his first impressions. He did not reach out. He did not retreat. He looked at this tall, unfamiliar man with the evaluating expression he had been born with, and after a few seconds he appeared to arrive at some private conclusion and returned his attention to the blanket. Seraphine set Nell gently into her own cot, and Nell did not wake, and they stood in the quiet room while Owen investigated his blanket, and the morning light came through the narrow window and fell across the floor in a clean, even line. Selim crouched down beside Owen's cot. He did not make sounds or faces the way some adults did with very young children, performing for them as though they needed to be entertained into accepting the encounter. He simply came down to Owen's level and was there, quietly, and held out one hand flat and open, which was neither demanding nor retreating. Owen looked at the hand. Then Owen put his much smaller hand on top of it, not gripping, just placing it there, with the same focused interest he applied to the blanket. Something happened on Selim's face that Seraphine had never seen there before. Not a breakdown of composure. Something quieter and more permanent, the expression of a person realizing, without drama, that they are more affected by something than they had understood they would be. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, to Owen rather than to her, "Hello." Owen, who did not speak yet, regarded him with full attention and said nothing, which was not rude but was entirely Owen. Seraphine stood in the doorway and watched and did not say anything. Some things did not improve with commentary. They stayed in the room for nearly an hour. Nell woke after 30 minutes and was, as was her nature, immediately present and observant. She looked at Selim with the settled patience of someone taking time to form a considered opinion. She allowed him to hold her briefly, with the specific, concentrated stillness of a child deciding whether a new thing is acceptable. She did not cry. That was, Seraphine thought, more than some adults managed. Later, the children settled again, Olive having quietly left a tea tray outside the door without knocking, they sat at the small table in the upstairs sitting area and talked. Not the way they had talked in the palace study, with documents on the table and the official weight of decisions to be made. The way two people talk when what they are negotiating is something that cannot be put on paper and therefore has to be said out loud, carefully, with full honesty on both sides. She told him things she had not said in the letter. She told him that leaving had been the right decision and she did not regret it, and that not regretting it did not mean it had been easy, and that both of those things were true simultaneously. She told him she was building something real here, something that belonged to her in a way that the palace rooms had never quite managed to feel, and that she was not prepared to dissolve that thing simply because the circumstances that had led to her building it had changed. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What would it take?" Not a challenge. A genuine question. She thought about it honestly. Time, she said. Here. Not in the capital. Not with the court as context. Here, in this village, in the ordinary way, where there is no throne available to anyone and no performance required, and I can see what you are like when none of that is available to either of us. He was quiet for a moment. I told the administrative council I would be away for 2 weeks. 2 weeks is not enough time to reach any conclusions, she said. But it is enough time to begin. Then we begin, he said. She looked at him across the table. She thought about what beginning meant, in this case. It meant weeks, possibly many of them. It meant a king managing his kingdom from 4 days right away, which was unprecedented and would generate questions. It meant a conversation that was not private, in the larger sense, because the people involved were not private people. It meant risk, real risk, not the managed kind she was good at but the unmanaged kind that came from choosing something before you could know with certainty what choosing it would cost. She had lived through real risk before. She had found, on the other side of it, things she had not expected. There is one condition, she said. Tell me, he said. You do not use a single official resource while you are here, she said. No palace staff, no royal messaging service, no administrative override of any local matter. If the kingdom requires a decision, you make it through the same channels anyone else would use at this distance. You are here as a person, not as a position. He looked at her for a moment. Agreed, he said. And then, with the very specific quality she had learned over months of watching him, the expression he used when something had confirmed the conclusion he had already reached, that is exactly the condition I expected you to set. You should stop expecting me, she said, though there was something in her voice that was not quite as level as her words. I should, he agreed. I do not seem to be able to stop. The Thursday market happened outside 2 days later, and Silam Draven, Alpha King, carried Owen in his arms through the stores while Seraphine spoke with Bridget about winter supply arrangements, and the older man who ran the tool store looked at the tall stranger with curious eyes and eventually decided he was someone's husband visiting from the south, which was the most ordinary possible explanation and therefore very likely the one he settled on. No one knew who he was. He bought Owen a small carved wooden bird from the toy store, because Owen had looked at it with the specific intensity of a small person who wanted something very much and was not going to say so, and Silam had noticed. Owen held the bird with both hands for the rest of the morning. In the evenings they talked. Real talk, the kind that did not have an agenda, about what she was building here, about what the kingdom looked like from inside it versus from the outside, about things they had thought about in the months apart and had not had anyone to tell. She challenged 3 things he said about the Eastern trade situation and was right about 2 of them, and wrong about 1 in a way that he explained clearly and she accepted, because being wrong was not interesting if you refused to update from it. He was not performing. That was what she had asked for. That was what she was getting. On the 9th evening, after the children were asleep and the village had gone quiet and the small sitting room was lit by the lamp on the table between them, he asked her something directly. Do you want this? He asked. Not, do you think it is the right decision? Not, have you determined that the conditions are met? Do you want it? She looked at the lamp. She thought about what it had felt like to leave. She thought about what it had felt like to stay here and be fine, which was real and not nothing and also genuinely not the same as what she had felt in those evenings in the palace study, talking until the fire had burned low and neither of them had noticed the time. She thought about Owen holding the carved bird with both hands. She thought about the way Selim had looked at Nell the first morning, when Nell had finally decided the question of whether he was acceptable was settled, and had gone to sleep against his shoulder with the absolute conviction of a small person who has made up her mind. Yes, she said. I want it. That is not the difficulty. What is the difficulty? He asked. The difficulty, she said, is that wanting something and it being right are two different questions, and I have spent my whole life making decisions based on what is right rather than what I want, and I am not entirely certain what to do with a situation where both of the answers are the same. He was quiet for a long time. I have the same difficulty, he said. I have been managing it for 14 months. She looked at him. He was honest. He was difficult and careful and occasionally too certain of himself and not at all easy, and he was not going to become easier over time, and she knew all of that clearly. She was also not easy. They were, in that respect, a reasonable match. Stay through the end of the month, she said. That is 3 more weeks past your original 2. After that we will talk about what next looks like. 3 weeks, he agreed. And we talk about what next looks like. She stood up and went to the window. The village was dark and quiet. The fountain in the small square had been shut off for the season and stood silent in the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance an autumn wind moved through the trees on the hillside above the village. She did not look at him when she spoke next. But she reached back, toward where she knew his hand was resting on the table, and she found it, and she held it. I am not saying yes to everything tonight, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. But I am not saying no either. I know that too, he said. They stayed like that for a while, her at the window, him at the table, their hands between them, the ordinary quiet of the village all around them, and upstairs 2 dark-haired children sleeping with the undisturbed confidence of people who believed the world was a safe and manageable place. She did not know yet exactly what the next chapter would look like. She had never been the kind of person who needed to know the whole shape of something before she could begin it. She was the kind of person who moved forward carefully and honestly and paid attention to what each step revealed. She had paid attention. She had seen a man ride 4.5 days alone through autumn roads, and stand in a plain room in a village that appeared on no official map, and hold his daughter in the careful, focused way of someone doing something for the first time and understanding its full weight, and buy a wooden bird for his son without being asked. She had seen him sit at this table for 9 evenings without once positioning himself, without once using the authority he carried simply because it was available. He had come as a person. She had asked him to. And he had. The rest, the decisions, the details, the shape of whatever they were choosing to build, all of that was ahead. She was not afraid of ahead. She had never been afraid of ahead. Ahead was simply where the next thing was, and she had always been good at moving toward things, even when moving was hard, even when the cost was real. She had left carrying his children and her own integrity, and she had built something from nothing in a place no one could easily reach, and she had done it without bitterness and without help and with her eyes fully open. She was, she knew, still the same person who had walked out of the palace before dawn 11 months ago. And so was he, in all the ways that mattered, but there were new lines at the edges of his eyes, and he looked at the children differently than she had expected even someone good to look at them, and he had ridden 4.5 days and waited in Olive's front room with his gloves in his hand and let her set every single time. Outside, the wind moved through the trees on the hill again. She held his hand in the quiet of the autumn evening and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, not know what came next. It was not frightening. It was the particular feeling of standing at the beginning of something that had been worth everything it had cost to reach. She held on to that. She was not going to let go.